On the 5th of June 1947, George Marshall, the Secretary of State of the United States, delivered a commencement address at Harvard University. The speech lasted approximately 12 minutes. It was not delivered with great oratorical passion. Marshall was a soldier, not an orator, and his delivery was characteristically understated. It was not even announced in advance as a major policy statement. The State Department had tipped off the BBC that it was significant, and Leonard Meal's BBC broadcast that evening was what alerted European governments to what they had just heard. The speech itself contained no specific numbers, no list of countries, no institutional framework, no formal proposal. It simply described Europe's economic situation as catastrophic, offered American assistance for a European recovery program, and invited the European governments themselves to take the initiative in designing what that program would look like. What followed from those 12 minutes was the European Recovery Program, known universally as the Marshall Plan, which distributed approximately $13.3 billion in American aid to 16 Western European countries between 1948 and 1952. It rebuilt the physical infrastructure of a continent that had been devastated by the most destructive war in human history. It stabilized the economies of France, Italy, the Netherlands, Britain, West Germany, and the other recipient countries, at a moment when political and economic instability was producing conditions in which communist parties, which had been strengthened by their role in wartime resistance movements, were competitive for political power. It established the institutional architecture of European economic cooperation. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which was the forerunner of the OECD, was created specifically to manage the Marshall Plan and became the organizational basis for European economic integration. It was, by any standard, one of the most successful foreign assistance programs in the history of international relations. It was also one of the most consequential exercises in American economic imperialism in the history of the post-war world. Not in a simple or crude sense. Marshall Plan aid was real, it was needed, and its effects on European economic recovery were genuine. But the Marshall Plan was not simply philanthropy. It was a strategic investment in a specific kind of European economy and a specific kind of European political order that served American interests in ways that were not always aligned with European interests, and that established dependencies on American capital, on American markets, on American strategic protection, on American-designed institutional frameworks that shaped European political and economic development for the following half-century in ways that the European recipients did not fully anticipate or freely choose. Understanding the Marshall Plan requires holding both of these things simultaneously. It saved Europe. It also, in specific and documentable ways, shaped Europe's economic development to serve American interests, embedded American commercial and financial power in the European economy in ways that constrained European economic sovereignty, and used the leverage of American aid to force open European markets to American goods and American capital in ways that European governments would not have accepted under normal competitive conditions. The plan was generous. It was also interested. Both things are true, and the standard history, which celebrates the generosity while ignoring the interest, is incomplete. To understand what the Marshall Plan was, what it did, and what its real consequences were, you have to begin not in June 1947, but in the specific situation of Europe at the end of the Second World War, and in the specific situation of the United States in the same period. Europe in 1945 was in a condition of physical and economic devastation that is genuinely difficult to convey to anyone who has not studied it in detail. The war had destroyed approximately 1/4 of Europe's physical capital. Its buildings, its factories, its railways, its ports, its power stations. In Germany, the destruction was even more extreme. Cities like Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin had been largely reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. In the Soviet Union, which suffered the greatest destruction of any belligerent, approximately 1,700 towns and cities and 70,000 villages had been destroyed. In Western Europe, the damage was less total but still severe. French industrial production in 1945 was approximately 40% of its pre-war level. Italian industrial production was similarly depressed. The Netherlands, which had been subjected to a deliberate Nazi starvation policy in the final months of the war, the Hunger Winter of 1944 to 1945, which killed approximately 22,000 Dutch civilians, was in particularly desperate condition. Beyond the physical destruction, Europe faced an economic crisis of a different kind. A crisis of financial imbalance that had been building since the beginning of the war, and that the physical destruction had accelerated. The war had transformed the United States from the world's largest debtor nation, a position it had occupied before the First World War, into the world's largest creditor nation. American industry had produced an extraordinary proportion of the materiel that the Allied powers had used to fight the war: aircraft, tanks, ships, ammunition, food, fuel, clothing, medicine, and had been paid for this production, partly in cash and partly in debt obligations from the Allied governments. By 1945, the United States held approximately 50% of the world's monetary gold reserves. Its manufacturing capacity was approximately 40% of world manufacturing output, and its trade surplus, the excess of its exports over its imports, was enormous. This trade surplus was the specific economic problem that the Marshall Plan was designed to address. And understanding it is essential for understanding what the Marshall Plan actually was. The United States was producing more goods than the rest of the world could pay for with its existing dollar reserves. Europe, which was the primary market for American exports, was running out of dollars. Its dollar reserves were being depleted by the need to pay for American imports of food, fuel, and raw materials at a pace that could not be sustained. If Europe ran out of dollars, it would be unable to buy American goods. If it was unable to buy American goods, American production would contract. If American production contracted, the United States would face the economic recession, or worse, the deflation and depression, that American policymakers feared above almost anything else in the immediate post-war period, because the Great Depression of the 1930s had been the defining economic trauma of the preceding generation, and the political conditions of 1947 made a repeat of it potentially catastrophic. This is the specific economic context in which the Marshall Plan was conceived, and it is the context that the standard celebration of the plan's generosity consistently underemphasizes. The Marshall Plan was not simply a humanitarian response to European suffering. It was also, simultaneously, a solution to a specific American economic problem: the need to keep European purchasing power sufficient to sustain the American export surplus on which American economic growth depended. The $13.3 billion that the United States provided to Europe was, in significant measure, an investment in maintaining the market for American exports, an investment in the continued profitability of American industry, and the continued employment of American workers. This does not make the Marshall Plan morally equivalent to exploitation. The European recipients genuinely needed the aid. The American economic motivation did not preclude genuine concern for European recovery. And the plan's actual effects on European economies were beneficial in ways that went beyond what the American commercial motivation alone would have required. But it does mean that the standard story, America gave Europe money out of generosity and strategic foresight, with no thought of commercial advantage, is false. The Marshall Plan served American commercial interests simultaneously with European recovery needs, and the specific terms and conditions of the plan were shaped by those American commercial interests in ways that the standard history underemphasizes. The specific commercial conditions that the United States attached to Marshall Plan assistance were extensive and consequential. Recipient countries were required to remove trade barriers between themselves, a requirement that opened European markets to American goods in a way that European governments, left to their own devices, might not have accepted. They were required to maintain convertible currencies, currencies that could be freely exchanged for dollars, which prevented European governments from using exchange controls to protect their economies from American competition. They were required to share their economic data with American officials, giving the United States unprecedented visibility into the internal workings of European economies. They were required to give American companies access to European markets and resources on terms equivalent to those available to European companies, a most favored nation requirement that prevented European governments from discriminating against American competitors. The most significant commercial condition, however, was the requirement that a substantial portion of the goods purchased with Marshall Plan funds be transported on American ships. The cargo preference requirements, which required that at least 50% of Marshall Plan shipments be carried on American-flagged vessels, transferred a significant portion of the commercial benefit of the plan from European shipping industries to American ones. The American shipping industry, which had been dramatically expanded during the war and which now faced the challenge of finding peacetime cargoes, was a beneficiary of Marshall Plan cargo preferences that is rarely mentioned in the standard accounts of the plan's implementation. The specific institutional structures that the Marshall Plan created, particularly the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, were designed in ways that served American commercial and strategic interests, while being presented as European institutions for European benefit. The OEEC was supposed to coordinate European economic policies and manage the distribution of Marshall Plan aid among the recipient countries. But its governance structure, its institutional culture, and its economic philosophy were shaped decisively by American officials who were present at every stage of its design and who used their leverage as the providers of the aid to ensure that the institution reflected American economic philosophy, the philosophy of open markets, free trade, convertible currencies, and private enterprise, rather than the more interventionist, more protectionist economic philosophies that many European governments of both left and right would have preferred. The question of who was excluded from the Marshall Plan is at least as revealing as the question of who was included. Stalin's Soviet Union was invited to participate, or at least an invitation was extended in terms that the State Department had reason to believe Stalin would reject, because the conditions attached to the invitation were conditions that a closed communist economy could not accept. The conditions included the sharing of economic information, the opening of markets, and the subordination of national economic planning to the requirements of the collective OEEC framework. all conditions incompatible with Soviet economic arrangements. Stalin's rejection of the Marshall Plan offer and his subsequent organization of the Communist Information Bureau and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance as Soviet-controlled alternatives was a predictable response to conditions that were partly designed to produce exactly this response. The division of Europe into a Marshall Plan West and a Soviet-controlled East was not simply the consequence of Soviet hostility to American generosity. It was the consequence of a plan whose specific terms and conditions made Soviet participation impossible, and whose designers were aware that this was the case. The Marshall Plan was as much an instrument for consolidating the division of Europe into American and Soviet spheres of influence as it was an instrument for European recovery. It served the strategic purpose of definitively aligning Western Europe with the American-led international economic system, and its architects understood it as serving this purpose from the beginning. George Kennan, the State Department policy planner, whose famous long telegram of February 1946 had provided the intellectual framework for the containment policy, was closely involved in the development of the Marshall Plan and was explicit about its strategic function. Kennan's policy planning staff memo of May 1947, written immediately before Marshall's Harvard speech, described the plan's purpose in terms that emphasized its strategic function at least as much as its humanitarian one. The plan was designed to prevent the political and economic conditions in Western Europe from producing communist electoral victories, which would bring governments to power that were aligned with the Soviet Union and that would effectively extend Soviet influence to the Atlantic coast. The Italian and French situations were particularly urgent. The Italian Communist Party was the largest communist party in Western Europe and had been gaining electoral strength on the basis of its wartime resistance record and the severe economic conditions of post-war Italy. The French Communist Party was similarly strong. It had received approximately 28% of the vote in the 1946 French elections and was a significant force in the governing coalition. American policymakers were genuinely alarmed by the prospect of communist electoral victories in France and Italy, and the Marshall Plan was partly designed as an economic intervention to prevent those victories by demonstrating that the Western capitalist system, with American support, could deliver prosperity. This strategic function, preventing communist electoral victories by delivering economic prosperity, was not simply a cynical manipulation of European politics. The communists who might have won those elections were genuinely aligned with the Soviet Union and would genuinely have pursued policies incompatible with the American-led international order. American concerns about communist influence in Western Europe were real, but the strategy for addressing those concerns, using the leverage of economic aid to shape European domestic political outcomes, was an exercise of American power over European political processes that went considerably beyond what any account of the plan focused solely on its generosity would acknowledge. The Truman administration's management of the Marshall Plan domestically, its successful navigation of the congressional politics of securing appropriations for a foreign assistance program of unprecedented scale, is a story of political communication that is itself historically interesting. The plan was presented to Congress and the American public in terms that emphasized its strategic function, its role in containing Soviet influence rather than its commercial function. The State Department's public advocacy of the plan emphasized the threat of communist takeover in Western Europe, and the importance of American generosity in preventing this outcome. The commercial benefits to American exporters and shipping companies were not the primary sales pitch, though they were real, and they contributed to the business community's support for the plan. The Republican Congress that was asked to fund the plan was not instinctively inclined to large-scale foreign assistance. The isolationist tradition in American conservatism was strong, and spending $13.3 billion on foreign governments was not a natural Republican priority. The shock of the Czech coup of February 1948, in which the Czechoslovak Communist Party, with Soviet backing, took power in a coup that shocked European opinion, provided the specific political catalyst that made congressional approval possible. The Czech coup demonstrated, in the most vivid possible terms, what the Soviet threat to Western European democracy looked like in practice, and it provided the Truman administration with the political leverage to secure the appropriations it needed. The implementation of the Marshall Plan between 1948 and 1952 was a complex administrative operation that involved hundreds of American officials working with their counterparts in 16 European countries to design and execute recovery programs tailored to the specific conditions of each recipient economy. The Economic Cooperation Administration, the American agency created to manage the plan, maintained country missions in each recipient country that negotiated with national governments over the specific uses of the aid and the specific economic policies that recipient governments would pursue in exchange for it. The specific negotiation between the ECA and the British government illustrates the tension between American commercial interests and British economic sovereignty that ran through the entire Marshall Plan experience. Britain received the largest single share of Marshall Plan aid, approximately $3.2 billion out of the total $13.3 billion. And the negotiations over the conditions attached to this aid produced some of the most contentious bilateral exchanges in the post-war Anglo-American relationship. The United States pressed Britain to make sterling convertible, to allow holders of sterling to exchange it freely for dollars as a condition of the aid. The British government was deeply reluctant to do this, understanding that sterling convertibility under existing conditions would produce a run on Britain's dollar reserves as holders of sterling rushed to convert. Their concerns were justified. When sterling was briefly made convertible in 1947, under the terms of the separate Anglo-American loan that preceded the Marshall Plan, the resulting drain on British reserves forced the suspension of convertibility within weeks. The specific conflict over sterling convertibility was not simply a technical dispute about exchange rate policy. It was a conflict about the future of the sterling area, the network of countries that held their reserves in sterling and used it as their primary trading currency, which was a legacy of British imperial and commercial dominance, and which gave Britain continuing financial influence over a substantial portion of the world economy. American pressure for sterling convertibility was partly a commercial calculation. Convertibility would make it easier for American companies to operate in the sterling area, and partly a strategic calculation. The erosion of the sterling area's insularity would strengthen the American-led international monetary system centered on the dollar. From the British perspective, American pressure on sterling convertibility was an attempt to use the leverage of Marshall Plan aid to accelerate the displacement of sterling by the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. This displacement was one of the most consequential long-term consequences of the Marshall Plan period. The Bretton Woods international monetary system established in 1944 had made the dollar the central currency of the international monetary order. Every currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. The Marshall Plan accelerated the dollar's dominance by providing the world with the large supply of dollars that the Bretton Woods system required to function. The dollar shortage that had characterized the immediate post-war period was addressed partly by Marshall Plan aid, which provided European countries with dollars they could use to settle international transactions. The consequence was a world in which the dollar's centrality in international finance was enormously strengthened, in which American financial institutions were positioned as the primary intermediaries of international capital flows, and in which the financial architecture of the post-war world reflected American interests to a degree that had no precedent in the history of international economic relations. The productivity campaigns that the ECA organized in conjunction with the Marshall Plan are another dimension of its impact that the standard history underemphasizes. The ECA financed visits by European workers and managers to American factories, farms, and businesses. Approximately 24,000 European visitors came to the United States under this program, with the explicit purpose of demonstrating the superiority of American management techniques, American labor relations, and American production methods. The productivity campaigns were designed to convince European workers and managers that the American model, mass production, tailorist management, cooperative rather than adversarial labor relations, consumption-oriented capitalism, was the model that Europe should adopt. The ideology that the ECA sought to transmit through these productivity campaigns was not simply technical. It was a specific vision of how a capitalist economy should work, a vision that emphasized productivity growth over redistribution, management prerogative over worker control, mass consumption over wage equality, and the market over the state. This vision was incompatible with the more socialist or social democratic visions of economic organization that were influential in European labor movements and left-wing parties. And the productivity campaigns were partly designed to undermine those visions by demonstrating the material abundance that American-style capitalism could produce. The Americanization of European consumer culture that accelerated during the Marshall Plan period, the spread of American products, American brands, American entertainment, American management consultants, American advertising techniques, was partly a commercial consequence of the trade liberalization that the Marshall Plan required, and partly a deliberate cultural strategy pursued by the ECA and the State Department. The dollar films, the jazz, the Hollywood movies, the Coca-Cola and the Reader's Digest, and the condensed book, all of these were instruments of a soft power campaign that was as much a part of the Marshall Plan's legacy as the physical reconstruction of European industry. West Germany's place in the Marshall Plan story is particularly revealing. Germany received approximately $1.4 billion in Marshall Plan aid, less than Britain or France. But the role of the Marshall Plan in the German economic recovery was qualitatively different from its role in the recoveries of the other recipient countries. The German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, that produced West Germany's extraordinary growth rates in the 1950s was not primarily a product of Marshall Plan aid, which was relatively modest in the German case. It was primarily a product of the currency reform of June 1948, which replaced the worthless Reichsmark with the new Deutsche Mark at a ratio that eliminated most existing monetary claims and gave the West German economy a clean monetary slate. Of the economic policies of Ludwig Erhard, who, as economics minister, liberalized prices and promoted private enterprise, and of the enormous productive capacity that German industry retained despite the physical destruction of German cities. The Marshall Plan's contribution to the German economic miracle was indirect but real. It provided the political and institutional framework within which German economic recovery could occur. It facilitated the trade liberalization that allowed German exports to find markets in Western Europe. And it provided the political reassurance to Germany's Western European neighbors that German reintegration into the Western economic system would occur under American supervision and within an institutional framework that protected European interests as well as German ones. The OEEC, the European Payments Union, and the various bilateral agreements that the Marshall Plan generated were the specific institutional mechanisms through which German economic reintegration occurred. And without the Marshall Plan's institutional framework, that reintegration might have been considerably more contentious and considerably more disruptive. The European Payments Union, established in 1950 with the support of Marshall Plan funds, was the specific institutional innovation that most effectively addressed the trade imbalances within Europe that were impeding intra-European trade. By creating a multilateral clearing system that allowed European countries to settle their trade imbalances with each other through a central clearinghouse rather than through bilateral dollar transactions, the EPU made possible a significant expansion of intra-European trade that had been constrained by the shortage of dollars available for bilateral settlement. The EPU was a genuinely European institution in its design and operation, and it was one of the Marshall Plan's most successful institutional legacies. It reduced European dependence on the dollar for intra-European trade, while simultaneously strengthening the overall framework of European economic integration. The Marshall Plan's relationship to European integration is one of its most important and most complex legacies. The United States actively promoted European economic and eventually political integration throughout the Marshall Plan period, for reasons that were both strategic and commercial. Strategically, a unified Western Europe would be more economically and militarily robust against Soviet pressure. Commercially, a unified European market with common trade rules, common regulatory standards, and eventually a common currency would be a more accessible and more attractive market for American companies than 16 separate national markets with different rules, different standards, and different currencies. The American promotion of European integration was genuine and consequential. Without American encouragement and the institutional frameworks that the Marshall Plan created, the progress toward European integration that produced the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and the Treaty of Rome in 1957 might have been considerably slower and less comprehensive. But American support for European integration was not selfless. It was support for a specific kind of European integration, an open, market-oriented integration that was compatible with American commercial access to the European market, rather than for the more protectionist or more statist forms of integration that some European advocates preferred. NATO was the security umbrella under which the Marshall Plan's economic integration was to take place. The American military guarantee that made it possible for Western European governments to concentrate their resources on economic recovery rather than on rearmament against the Soviet threat. But NATO was also the institutional mechanism through which American strategic dominance over Western Europe was formalized. The framework within which European defense policy would be coordinated with and ultimately subordinated to American strategic priorities. The NATO relationship created a specific dependency. European governments that relied on American military protection were constrained in their foreign policy choices in ways that governments providing their own security were not. The extent to which this military dependency translated into political dependency, into an inability or unwillingness to pursue foreign or economic policies that conflicted with American preferences, varied among NATO members and across the Cold War period. France under de Gaulle was the most dramatic example of a NATO member attempting to resist this dependency. De Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command in 1966 and developed an independent French nuclear deterrent, specifically to reduce French dependence on American strategic protection. But France's partial independence was exceptional. For most Western European governments, the NATO relationship and the security dependency it created was a permanent constraint on the degree to which they could diverge from American preferences on major strategic and economic questions. What historians get wrong about the Marshall Plan is not the facts of what it accomplished. The rebuilding of European economies, the stabilization of European politics, the creation of the institutional architecture of European cooperation. These achievements are real, and they deserve the recognition they receive. What historians get wrong is the framework. The Marshall Plan is usually presented as a story about American generosity and strategic wisdom, about a great power that chose, at the moment of its maximum dominance, to invest in the recovery of its friends and allies, rather than to exploit its position for immediate commercial advantage. This presentation is incomplete in ways that matter. The Marshall Plan served American commercial interests simultaneously with European recovery needs, and its architects were aware of this simultaneity. The plan's conditions, trade liberalization, currency convertibility, market access for American goods and companies, served American commercial interests in specific and measurable ways. The plan's institutional design, the OEEC, the EPU, the bilateral agreements, reflected American economic philosophy and served American strategic interests. The plan's exclusion of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was partly the consequence of conditions that were designed to be unacceptable to Soviet-style economies, not simply the consequence of Soviet hostility to American generosity. None of this makes the Marshall Plan evil or its accomplishments illusory. European recovery was real. The institutional architecture it created was largely beneficial. The prevention of communist electoral victories in France and Italy was, from the perspective of political freedom, genuinely positive. The promotion of European integration, however self-interested in part, produced institutions that have contributed to decades of European peace and prosperity. The Marshall Plan was a sophisticated exercise in enlightened self-interest, an investment in the conditions of American prosperity and security that happened also to benefit the recipients of the investment in genuine and lasting ways. But the full truth, the truth that includes both the generosity and the interest, both the humanitarian impulse and the commercial calculation, both the promotion of European recovery and the promotion of American commercial access, both the support for European integration and the maintenance of European dependence on American capital and military protection, is more complicated and more instructive than the standard celebration suggests. It is the truth that honest history requires, and it is the truth that this video has tried to tell. The Marshall Plan was not a gift. It was an investment. It was a very good investment for the United States, and it was a very good investment for Europe. Both things can be true. The fact that both things are true, that American generosity and American self-interest were simultaneously present in the plan's design and implementation, is not a scandal or a betrayal. It is simply the way that great powers behave when they are at their best, not with pure altruism, which great powers are not capable of, but with enlightened self-interest that happens to align sufficiently with the interests of others to produce outcomes that both sides can call beneficial. George Marshall understood this. His 12-minute speech at Harvard on June 5, 1947, did not promise generosity. It offered partnership. Partnership on American terms, to be sure, but partnership nonetheless. Europe accepted. The partnership produced a world that, for all its imperfections and all its inequalities of power, was considerably better than the world that Soviet dominance of Western Europe would have produced. That is the Marshall Plan's genuine achievement. It deserves to be understood honestly. If this story changed the way you think about the relationship between generosity and interest in the foreign policy of great powers, about whether assistance is ever truly selfless, or whether enlightened self-interest is the most we can realistically expect from states pursuing their own advantage, subscribe. Every week we go deep on the decisions and the interests and the specific mechanisms through which the post-war world was built. Drop a comment below on whether you think the Marshall Plan was primarily about European recovery or primarily about American commercial advantage. I read every one. I'll see you in the next one.